Today is the 15th of September, 2015, and the topic is Ronald Reagan's economy from 1981 to 88, and this is part 2 because we already had a part 1 over a month ago. My guest is Dave DeWitt, reporter and editor of the Athens News, and I am Robert Whaley, retired historian from Ohio University, and this is the Athens Speakout, number 346. Now, back in August, we discussed that Ronald Reagan on TV won a smashing victory in defeating the incumbent Jimmy Carter. And Jimmy Carter was in trouble with an Iranian revolution provoked by the Ayatollah Khomeini. And at the same time, Saddam Hussein was in charge of Iraq. And a long war broke out, a bilateral war, which supposedly the United States was neutral. But behind the scenes, the CIA was stimulating the actual killing of both Iranians and Iraqis. It was a long war, it was a bitter war, and it lasted from, some say 1979, others say 1980, until 1988 at the end of the Reagan administration. Now, nobody in the United States knew whether Saddam Hussein, the dictator of Iraq, was behind it, or the Ayatollah Khomeini, the dictator in Iran, was behind it. Officially, Ronald Reagan claimed that the public enemy number one was Iran, the Ayatollah Khomeini. The publicity called Ayatollah Khomeini the number one enemy. The TV called them that, and Ronald Reagan went along with that. But behind the scenes, the Department of Defense and the CIA were supplying Saddam Hussein with some secret intelligence and supplies of weapons in order to defeat the stronger Iranian army. Now, the Iranians had trouble getting replacement of parts, because the parts were all due to the American subsidization of Iran that had been going on since the 1950s. And this revolution kind of cut off the Ayatollah Khomeini's weapons, but they got some second-hand weapons secretly from Israeli intelligence, some Soviet weapons, and that sustained the war on both sides. And both the Iraqis and the Iranians financed these wars through their own oil weapons, their own oil supplies to buy weapons. So the war seemed to go on for a long, long time. And Ronald Reagan was absolutely silent. He never made any comment about that. He was still talking about anti-communism and the need to win the Cold War against the Soviet Union, as if the Middle East didn't exist. He was still living in the 1950s, at least ideologically. And in fact, Joseph Stalin had died in 1953, but not very many voters seemed to think about that. Now, Nixon and Kissinger treated both the People's Republic of China and the Soviet Union at the United Nations equally, at the United Nations Security Council. And Henry Kissinger and Nixon had a secret plan to withdraw the American army from the losing Indochina War. And but Ronald Reagan was still talking about Red China, as if there was no visit to Beijing, which was quite sensational when Nixon was still in office. Now, Ronald Reagan had little to say about Henry Kissinger, and he had little to say about Jimmy Carter, except that Jimmy Carter was the victim. And Jimmy Carter was a weakling for not standing up to fighting the Soviet Union, and the mass media denounced denounced Carter as a weakling. And Ronald Reagan then pretended that Franklin Roosevelt, Lyndon Johnson, John Kennedy, even Richard Nixon. History began with Ronald Reagan. If you listen to him, he was a first-class propagandist. He was the only movie star who ever was elected president. And very few Democrats in the House of Representatives or the Senate, and even fewer Republicans, understood what the new Middle East wars were all about. The newspapers took Ronald Reagan seriously, but the Democratic Party did not take his propaganda very seriously, but they didn't have much influence on the mass media. So anyway, my first question to our guest, Dave DeWitt, who were some of the stars in Ronald Reagan's cabinet? Although he was a weak president personally, he had a first-class cabinet. Stars, who were they?
Well, I guess we can start with the big three in any presidential candidate cabinet, really.
Right.
Secretary of State started off as Alexander Haig and then became George P. Shultz in 1982.
Right.
Secretary of the Treasury, Donald Regan for the first term.
Right.
James Baker for the second term. James Baker was his chief of staff during his first term.
Right.
Secretary of Defense, Caspar Weinberger.
Right.
Who played a big role in Reagan's massive expansion of the military.
That's true.
Chief of Staff, I mentioned James Baker, was a very influential chief of staff.
James Baker III.
Right. Vice President George H.W. Bush.
A very powerful vice president.
Yes, a very powerful vice president. And Baker actually started with him in the primary before Reagan was elected.
Right.
And then another cabinet level one I think worth mentioning, which we are going to get to later, the Director of Office of Management and Budget, David Stockman.
Yeah, right.
Are there any others?
Well, I would like to elaborate a little bit on Caspar Weinberger and George Shultz. Mm-hmm. They were both on the board of the Bechtel Corporation, and they both had PhDs from Harvard and MIT, and they were both managers of the military-industrial complex, and they were making money in building bases all over the world, and particularly in the Middle East.
Absolutely. That's why they had such a vested interest in expanding the military as they did.
And they were building bases in the Middle East, in Latin America, and Africa, and they even maintained bases in Europe and NATO, building air bases and so on. So they making big profits, as if Eisenhower had never been president and spoke out against the military-industrial complex.
Which he did in his farewell address.
Which was soon forgotten by television.
Very quickly forgotten.
Yeah, right.
By television.
But I didn't forget it
American
as a historian.
People, by the Kennedy administration.
Right, that's right. So we got that story pretty clear. So Bush came from Texas, but also worked for the CIA, had experience at that. And Caspar Weinberger came from California, and Texas and California economically were a powerful combination with money behind the Reagan administration. And I want to say something about the CIA. I want to say anything about who's the CIA director behind these wars? I know that it began with the Carter administration.
Right.
And Carter began
and
the operation.
This. And Carter under the Carter's administration, he rolled back the CIA's clandestine operation.
Yeah, but he did authorize a small budget.
He did.
And then Reagan gets in there and expands
and
it
it
all
comes
the way
back
to
with
H&E.
a raging force. Yes.
Yeah, right. That's right. And they were supporting wars in Pakistan.
Everywhere
Yeah.
you can think of.
Right.
They had their hands in everything.
Right.
And,
So big oil was winning, big military contracts were winning, and Ronald Reagan was fortunate in the appointments in the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, as an economic power, was in decline, and in 1981 there were 3 old men, but in 1985 Mikhail Gorbachev took over, and Moscow began to be talking about another arms deal, which Jimmy Carter failed to pull off. And Haig then was a holdover from the Carter administration and kind of bungled as his first Secretary of State because he was trying to stimulate the Israelis in the 5th Arab-Israeli War in invading Beirut, and Reagan and Caspar Weinberger and Schultz said, that's a disaster. We have to get a new Secretary of State there. So that was a false start, and the USSR was #1 in production of tanks back in 1945, but they were rapidly becoming obsolete because the Soviet Union was basically a landlocked empire, and Ronald Reagan was simply acting out his simplistic idea of Christianity. And he appealed to high school graduates, and he got his own BA back in the 30s from the Disciples of Christ Christian group, and he didn't have to change anything of his own religious background, although when he got to Washington, probably Caspar Weinberger persuaded him to join the more prestigious Presbyterian Church to get more clout with the Republican Party. Anyway, Ronald Reagan began to talk about being a born-again Christian in order to compete with Jimmy Carter on the mass media. And I think we're ready for a second question, unless you have any more comments or questions about this.
No.
Okay, so what are the results of the 1980 election as far as Carter and Reagan were concerned, in the House of Representatives and the Senate? What was the statistical results of that election? Do you remember that?
Well, obviously Reagan won the election against Carter.
Right.
Pretty significantly.
43 million people, 900,000 popular vote against Carter's 35 million, 400,000 popular vote.
Right.
And the Electoral College was even stronger for Reagan. 489 votes, and Reagan won 44 states, and Carter picked up 6 states with only 49 electoral votes. Now, the House of Representatives and the Senate were a little more competitive.
Yeah, the Democrats maintained control.
Right.
Over the House.
Right.
With Tip O'Neill, but they lost seats.
They lost some seats, but not enough for the majority.
Right, not enough to lose the majority.
Right. But they did the Republicans took the Senate.
The Republicans took the Senate with 53 seats to 46 seats for the Democrats.
Good. And who was Howard Baker?
Howard Baker was the majority leader, the Republican the new majority leader from Tennessee, the Republican.
And he was a kind of a liberal Republican, as we look back upon it.
More of a Rockefeller Republican.
Yeah, right. Well, that was the liberal Republican.
Right.
And then Tip O'Neill then was an opposition party. Now, what about
Speaker of the House?
Speaker of the House, Tip O'Neill maintained his. He maintained an opposition all the way to 88.
Yes.
It was an election which was a defeat for democratic values, but it was not a disaster on the scale of Benito Mussolini in 1922, in which a democratic society and constitution was overthrown by Mussolini. And in
fascism was established.
Right. And in 1933, Adolf Hitler got rid of Weimar Republican.
Established the Third Reich, also fascist.
And then we had
Franco in Spain.
Franco in Spain. Now, the Japanese were always an empire, and they really never had a democracy to repeat. So the Japanese Empire was a kind of a quasi-fascist imperial traditional society. And that led to World War II.
Complete with the whole concept of the emperor as divine.
So we want to get now to the director of the budget, the Office of Management and Budget, with David Stockman. And how did Reagan negotiate a new tax bill? And we want to show a chart of this. But before we do that, I think we ought to quote Ronald Reagan's inaugural address, January 1981. This is one of his famous stupid quotes, but nobody thought it was stupid. He said, "Government is not the solution. Our problem is that government is the problem."
Yeah.
Oh, why did they cheer for such an absurdity?
Oh, they still do.
Yeah, the key to that is, what is the definition of we and our?
Right, because it's our self-government.
Yeah.
It's our government.
It's the people's government.
If you
believe
we're
in the Constitution.
Right. we are a republic. That's why I get upset when people talk about, the government this, the government that.
Yeah.
Well, it's your government.
That's right. That is true. And that was called We the People of the United States. In order to form a more perfect union, do establish these United States of America.
And if you read Madison or
Right.
Jefferson, or even Hamilton, I mean, it's very clear that the mandate for establishing the U.S. Constitution came from the people. It came directly from the people. It's the people's government.
Right. And this R, or we, I have a joke for that. I think I've told you that before, about Lone Ranger and Tonto. You remember that joke?
I don't think so.
Sure you do. Lone Ranger and Tonto were very famous when I was a kid.
Yeah, I'm familiar with them.
Okay, so they're riding out on the plains, and Tonto says to Lone Ranger, and they see a band of Apaches coming. "Look," Lone Ranger says, "we're in trouble." Tonto says, "No, you're in trouble." Who is we? And that's a thing that still plagues politics to this day.
Yeah.
People, the average voter, do not make the distinction between Democrats and Republicans, House of Representatives and Senate, and different religions. It's all one big stew, okay? And Ronald Reagan was a great propagandist for that. Okay, well, let's look at this chart now on television. And this was the budget drafted by Stockman for Ronald Reagan and the Congress to negotiate. Now, half of that, with the blue line outlined, is untouchable.
That's
the money
military.
Going to go to the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, the Marine Corps, the CIA. This is the Pentagon budget. And that's more than 51%. Now, the little orange one down in the corner is also somewhat sacred. It's the interest on the national debt.
Right.
You can't cut that.
Yeah, if you default if you don't pay that.
Yeah, you got to pay the big, rich Wall Street financiers like Gates, who can afford to buy bonds, and like some Japanese and some British and some Germans who want to have safe investments and buy.
U.S. Treasury bonds are a very safe investment.
Yeah, right.
Because that always gets paid.
That always gets paid. Although the Republicans in recent years
They've
have tried to cut it.
Yeah. Well, and they're playing with fire there, because if that were to not get paid, it would be like defaulting on your mortgage.
That's true.
The banks would come to repossess. The value of the dollar would crash, basically, and
Right.
our economy would
That
go
is
into
true.
wild turmoil.
So the
Many people would suffer.
Federal Reserve keeps kicking the can down the road every 3 months.
Yeah.
And some people are optimistic that we'll get through the next 3 months, and some think there's going to be...
Yeah, we do these continuing resolutions
Yeah, right.
instead of passing.
Well,
the
looking
budget.
at this chart then, we have the other colored ones. The yellow one is environment. That's flexible. The Congress is going to debate on that, whether they're going to increase taxes or hold the line. Energy, somewhat flexible. Education, somewhat flexible. That's going from yellow to green to white. And then we come to Social Security, the red one. That's can't be touched. That was established.
Well, that's a trust fund.
That's a trust fund, and the old
And it's paid for by payroll taxes.
right, and it's an insurance policy. Well, nobody's going to cut well, they keep talking about the need to cut it, but they don't cut it.
Republicans want to cut benefits by raising the retirement age and doing other gimmicks like that. Democrats generally want to lift the cap on wages that go into paying for Social Security.
And then you have a
and fix it
escalator
that way.
clause for the cost of living.
Right.
And the Congress has, under Democratic Congress, O'Neill, keep escalating that and increasing the payments to the widows who need that pension. Then we have another a sacred trust, Medicaid, established by Johnson. Now, the Medicaid can be cut because that goes to the states.
Yes.
And there are stingy states like Mississippi, and then there are generous states like Minnesota
Right.
who pay the poor to survive. I don't know what they do in Mississippi. Have to double down, I guess. Anyway, science, that can be cut or expanded. And then, of course, highway trusts. This is what the Democrats are now campaigning for. This is what Sanders wants, is more money, New Deal, highways, new pipes, infrastructure, and that'll give jobs.
Yes.
That's where we are
You've
now.
heard the phrase crumbling infrastructure.
We've
That's
got
what
it.
that refers to.
And some Republicans think they can kick the can down the road. And then we have
They
agriculture.
prefer not to, they don't seem to like infrastructure investment at all.
No, they want to invest in China where you can make more money on the profits. Invest
Yeah.
in Pakistan.
It's somewhat baffling.
Baffling. Well, if greed is the answer. Greed.
Yeah.
Highest dollar counts. And then we have agriculture. Well, under Lyndon Johnson, they used to say, pay the agriculture bill, subsidies.
Yeah. Unfortunately, a lot of those subsidies these days go to huge
Yeah,
agribusiness.
that's right.
Instead of your local
The,
farmers.
the local farmers are selling out.
Yeah.
So I guess you want to say anything more about that chart and the problem of the budget?
Well, that's
How you cut the
1981's, right?
How they cut the pie?
Yeah. Well, they get to this Economic Recovery Tax Act of 1981.
And what were the results?
Kemp-Roth tax
Yeah.
cut.
What was the result of that?
Well, the results were that they, I would call it a redistribution of wealth.
That's right.
An upward redistribution of wealth to
That's right.
the
Right.
highest incomes in America. They
Correct.
did very well.
That's right.
Those in
they
the middle
cut
and
back-
at the bottom did not do so well.
They cut the income tax rate. Under Carter, it was 70%. Ronald Reagan and the Congress reduced it to 50%. Now, they also gave a tax cut to the very low bracket. The lowest bracket, it was cut from 14%
To 11.
11, right. So they got actually a tax break, the lowest class. And that got enough Democratic votes to go in a bipartisan bill. But will give the poor a toothpick, but we, the Republicans, get the big logs.
Yeah.
And people don't know how to count the money.
No.
We have janitors going around here. Well, Reagan gave me a tax break.
They think that their well, $1,000 a year is a nice windfall,
Yeah.
but the really nice windfall is the
Billions.
billions a year to the
Right.
top 1% of the top 1%.
And then in the next few years, 82, 83, 84, 85, Ronald Reagan took the tax cut back by expanding another,
Right.
fiddling with new taxes.
Yes, and that's what usually we saw the same thing in Ohio when John Kasich goes around talking about how much he cut income taxes. Well, the truth is that he only cut income taxes for the top earners, and they
Right.
got about a $5,000 cut
Right.
each. The rest of us, those in the lower brackets, we actually got a tax increase, and it's also not really a tax cut; it's a tax shift because while the state budget loses revenue from income taxes, John Kasich has made that up by raising sales taxes,
Right.
which are regressive and affect people
Right.
with lower incomes
Right.
the most.
Well, this is what the Democrats called trickle-down economy. And
Voodoo economics.
that's what George Bush 41
During
said.
the campaign, yeah.
Yeah, but it only lasted for 2 years.
Right.
And he got defeated.
Right.
Well, anyway, trickle-down economy was called supply economics.
Supply side. yeah.
And David Stockman, when he first came in, believed in supply economics and believed in the Republican Party. But as he worked
He
with
did.
the statistics,
He became disillusioned.
he became disillusioned.
I've
Right.
got a quote here I'd like to share from him
Very
about
good.
his disillusionment,
Right.
referring to the Kemp-Roth tax cut
Right.
and this bill that we're
Well,
discussing.
good. Good, you've done some research.
This is Stockman's quote.
Good.
I mean, Kemp-Roth, Reagan's 1981 tax cut, was always a Trojan horse to bring down the top rate. It's kind of hard to sell trickle-down, so the supply-side formula was the only way to get a tax policy that was really trickle-down. Supply-side is trickle-down theory. So, none of us really understands what's going on with all these numbers, she said. And he was quoted in the Atlantic Monthly saying that, and the way he puts it, after being taken into the woodshed by the president due to his candor with the Atlantic Monthly, Stockman became concerned with the projected trend of increasingly large federal deficits and the rapidly expanding national debt. And on August 1st, 1985, he resigned.
Right. And then he took that little article and blew it up to a book.
He made a book out of it. He made himself a little bit more money.
And that was the end of Ronald Reagan's theory of new economics. Well, I think you've covered that.
Well, it was in that sense, but you see the supply side lie has been pushed ever since 1981 all the way up to today, like I was referring to with John Kasich right here in Ohio.
That's right.
And all of, I haven't heard any of the current Republican presidential candidates
Nobody's
say
going to
anything
touch
different.
it. No, they're not going to take it.
It's a lie, and it's sacrosanct in the Republican Party. Nobody will come out and admit that funneling money toward the top does not mean that it's going to create a rainfall for the rest of us. It's just going to get stuck at the top.
Right.
And since then, we've had exploding wealth and income inequality, now at levels not seen since the Gilded Age. So, as I think we've mentioned before, we are in a second Gilded Age.
And it may get to be a crash. 2008 may return.
It could get
Or they
very
may take
bad.
the road, but they may raise the interest rate to 2%.
They might. There's a lot of things that could happen, but one of the viable options is really bad stuff.
That's right.
For a lot of Americans. And a
Yeah,
lot
the stock
heartache and
market is
struggle.
volatile. Goes up 100 points, down 200, up 300 points, down.
Yeah.
Who knows? Anyway, we're getting back to 1981. Ronald Reagan. How did he bust the unions? You know anything about that?
Well, this is a funny story because the union that he became famous for busting supported him in the 1980 election over Jimmy Carter.
Yeah.
The PATCO, the Professional Air Traffic Controllers Organization, is a trade union, operated from 1968 until it was decertified by Reagan. Interestingly, I think that in the 1980 election, PATCO refused to back Jimmy Carter and instead endorsed Ronald Reagan. Its refusal to endorse the Democratic Party stemmed from poor labor relations with the FAA.
The FAA, that's
The Federal
Aviation Administration.
Aviation Administration, exactly. So what ended up happening, though, was on August 3rd, 1981, the union declared a strike seeking better working conditions and better pay. And what Reagan's response to that was that he declared their strike a peril to national security.
Right.
And ordered them back to work under the terms of the Taft-Hartley Act of 1947.
Right.
And only about 1,300 of 13,000 actually returned to work. And so Reagan subsequently demanded that the remaining workers return to work within 48 hours. And if they did not, they would be fired.
And he fired them.
And he fired them. And that was the end of PATCO. And he banned them from working in federal service
we have
ever again.
a question from the audience.
No, we're
Station break.
going to take a station break. I just wanted to mention, I met several air traffic controllers that were fired by Reagan, at least 6,
Wow.
because I was working in Los Angeles
In the trucking business.
in the trucking business, and those people were retrained
Right.
by the government
Right.
and became truck drivers. So
Yeah.
I think it was somewhat of a pay cut, but
Yeah,
They survived.
were
Yeah, they
employed.
survived.
they got they got some sort of job. So, station break?
Station break. Well, my name is Robert Whaley. I'm a historian. I've been following elections since I voted when I was 30 years old for John Kennedy. And I must say, I've never voted for a Republican.
Neither have I.
And I didn't even vote for Lyndon Johnson.
We've got that in common,
I voted
too.
for a socialist party because Lyndon Johnson
In
was
64.
was escalating the war, and
Because
I
of
knew he
Vietnam.
was a phony.
Sure.
Who'd you vote for, Robert?
I voted for the Socialist Labor candidate.
Who was that?
Well, I guess I forgot his name at this point,
Oh, okay.
but the party was established in Cleveland, the Socialist Labor. It's the Arm and Hammer. They had an independent group of socialists.
Yeah.
It was called the Socialist Labor Party, and it was established in 1900.
Yeah.
Before the Lenin Revolution, okay? And they maintained socialism, but they always got a token amount of votes. They were not the regular socialists. They were not.
Right.
They were not.
Okay, tell me a little bit about that. I never asked you about this guy, I don't think. Lyndon LaRouche.
Well, he's a phony.
But what did he call himself?
Well, Lyndon LaRouche.
What party affiliation?
Well,
did he have?
Lyndon, if I understand Lyndon LaRouche, is that he was a so-called populist. Now, the problem with the word populist is that there are populists on the right and populists on the left.
I see.
You can make an argument that Hitler was a populist.
I don't think Hitler ever claimed to be a populist, but I'll tell you who did, were the Russians. The first populist party,
The Bolsheviks?
no, before the Bolsheviks,
Oh, okay.
back in the 1860s,
Yeah.
when Lenin's father, he was a school teacher, and he was a populist. They called it the People's Party. The People's Party was an old underground party in Tsarist Russia. And they made all parties
Party.
illegal.
Yeah.
Okay. So the
Populism
populists,
simply means it's a play toward the everyman, toward the people.
yeah, but the name
from
populist,
right or left.
the populists were left wing on economic issues back in 1900, and they came
In America?
In America, they came from the South,
Yeah, the
and they-
Democratic South.
and they came from the Midwest,
They
and
would
they were
advocate
saying that
agriculture.
they would denounce Wall Street, they denounced the gold standard.
Yeah, so you're William
Yeah.
Jennings Bryan
Well,
his
he was a Democrat. He was not a populist. But there was an independent populist party.
Oh, you're talking about an independent, the third party.
It was a third party,
Okay.
and they called themselves the populist. But they were conservative on race because they were racist, coming from the South. At the same time, they were radical when it came to Wall Street. So there's a left-wing populist on money and a left-wing populist when it comes to standing the ground from the Civil War. Whites and blacks are totally different alien races. So the populists got a bad name when Franklin Roosevelt came to power. And they denounced populists. And the progressives...
Who was the candidate during FDR's time?
It was FDR. He invented the New Deal.
No, I mean, when Roosevelt was in, when he
Who's a
ran,
populist
who was
candidate?
a populist candidate,
Oh, it disappeared.
it did.
Yeah.
It disappeared
So
because
it's gone.
it disappeared by the progressives.
Well,
The
Right.
the
The
progressives
progressives
became
emerged.
a left-wing Democratic Party,
So they repudiated.
the populists,
The populists.
and the populists gradually lost strength, and they were confined
You had-
to Mississippi and Texas. They were confined to the rural South.
how would you classify Huey Long?
Well, he's a right-wing populist.
The Kingfish.
Yeah, he's a right-wing. He got the majority of the votes in the state of Louisiana. But the
And he
progressives...
was planning to run against Roosevelt in
That's right.
36
That's
before
right.
he was
He was a
gunned
right-wing.
down in 35.
Yeah, but he was popular in Louisiana,
And he was anti-Wall Street.
and he wanted to
he
confiscate
spoke-
the oil companies and support the
I
university.
always like his body language when
Yeah,
he spoke. He was
yeah.
always waving his fist in the air like this and bringing it down and back up here.
Oh, kick their ass.
But
And he would go on he would stop, a doorman would ask him a question, and he'd go on lecturing him for 15
Yeah.
minutes.
and he was assassinated in 1935 by
Right.
some sensitive Jew who said, "This guy is going to be an American fascist. We don't get rid of him." And Roosevelt was secretly happy.
Well, yeah, he had a very antagonistic relationship with Roosevelt. He thought Roosevelt was too beholden to the bankers.
Well, he was in a way.
Well, he was, but I thought Roosevelt had a very artful style of politics.
Well, he was
And his idea with the bankers was to not antagonize them outright, but
That's
more to try to schmooze them
That's right.
and appeal to them.
Well, he said a new
in
deal.
that way.
A new deal. We'll accept populists, we'll accept progressives, but you vote the Democratic Party. That's what
right.
he said.
You know, I'm not sure, but I recall seeing a sign down there around New Orleans or Baton Rouge or something.
Vote for Huey Long?
On it. Huey
Long.
You know, Huey Long Expressway.
Well, his brother stayed in the Congress right up to Lyndon Johnson.
He's a fascinating character. It's worth reading All the King's Men.
Yeah.
And or watching the movie at least.
Yeah,
And reading
right.
about Huey Long.
So anyway, I guess we've finished the smash of the unions. Or do you want to say something about the legacy of this? How does this smashing of the traffic controllers lead to other unions?
Well, what it set
What
off
happened?
was this idea in the business community that, oh, hey, wait a second. Now, there's a managerial strategy that we can really get behind. And it led a lot of business leaders to kind of emulate Reagan's strategy
That's
of
right.
being tough on the unions and,
Right.
and not being shy to fire their workers
Right.
and just replace them. And
So
so you saw a
the-
lot more of that in subsequent years
Right,
after Reagan
right,
busted the
right.
air traffic
Intimidation
controllers.
of the unions,
Yeah.
basically.
So from
Absolutely.
1962 to 1981, there were lots of strikes. There were 39 illegal strikes during that period. And General Motors always paid the workers off. We'll just raise the wages.
Sure.
We'll raise the price of the car. As long as prosperity lasted, you could deal with the unions. But now in 81, the budget was really getting cut. And Reagan was saying, I want to balance the budget. So he was going to be tough on the unions, and he was going to be tough on taxes and spending. And that led to some backlash. But the unions got
did.
weaker ever since.
And that was Reagan's whole, he's
Right.
always pitching himself in that way.
Yeah. So what did Ronald Reagan really know about the free market, which he kept quoting Adam Smith?
What did he really know about it?
Yeah. What did
I think I don't think much. Not in any sort of real or responsible
had
or scholarly sense.
No, no.
I think he had.
Well, he did remember that under Adam Smith, you have to balance the budget. That was his favorite
He
slogan.
did remember that, but he didn't remember any of the morality aspects of Adam Smith.
Right.
Well, wasn't he more of a follower of Milton Friedman?
The Chicago School,
That's
Friedman.
Right. And Friedman was a so-called monetarist. He quoted laissez-faire, but it was a new kind of philosophy, a little bit. Adam Smith was not a monetarist. He was not interested in the banks. His idea was the market was naturally a balance.
Yeah, his theory was about balancing various forces.
If there were 50 people who were blacksmiths and they made steel and iron, and they made too much, there would be a surplus, and they'd go out of business, and they'd have to go in the textile business. So the textile was trying to catch up with the railroads, and the railroads trying to catch up with the coal, and the cotton gin was part of it, as they needed more cotton in England. That gave a boom to the South to raise more cotton. So there was a real balance of trade between British and American market, and then eventually the Industrial Revolution spreads to Belgium and then France, and then everybody got into laissez-faire until about 1870. And then Marx comes along and says, well, laissez-faire fails. Yeah,
and he conceived of it as Marx came along with the big conception of the class struggle.
Right.
The proletariat versus the bourgeois.
Robert, can you explain Karl Marx's philosophy?
Right. Well, Karl Marx was a German philosopher who, in the 1830s, learned about Hegel's philosophy. Now, Hegel was a radical in one sense, in that he believed that the French Revolution was caused by ideas. And he said, well, the French Revolution took place in the minds of philosophers before anybody shot anybody. So he believed in a philosophy of idealism. And there was a struggle between the medieval church and the Renaissance church. And then there was a struggle between the Renaissance church and the Protestant Reformation. And then that led to the Enlightenment and the Age of Reason and Sir Isaac Newton. And that eventually leads to Voltaire and radical French philosophers, see. So Hegel got the idea, well, the French Revolution is finished, and Germany is going to be the wave of the future. The world idealistic spirit is going to be in Germany.
Right.
Because Napoleon had overreached himself and had invaded Germany. Yeah. So Germany was rising up now because of the Napoleonic Wars. Well, so then in the colleges, there were left-wing Hegelians and right-wing Hegelians. So the right-wing Hegelians said, well, Hegel is really a German patriot and wants the Prussian monarchy to lead to unification. They were the conservatives. Marx said, turned it upside down and said, the struggle is not with ideas, but materialistic struggle. And he goes back to the French Revolution. The bourgeois revolution or the middle class revolution was against the aristocracy. Well, the next revolution is going to be the working class, the proletariat, against the middle class, and that's going to be the wave of the future. And he says, workers of the world, unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains. Who are the enemies? The Pope, Metternich, and Guizot. And that started 1848 in the Communist Manifesto. Is that enough on Marx?
That's enough.
Okay.
Very good. Very enlightening.
So then socialism begins to expand. Expands fast in Europe. Very slow in the United States. You know the why? We know why Marx didn't get any root in the United States. It was not very popular. Yeah. Socialism was weak. Well, it's because of the relationship between land and the working class. England, France, Germany, Italy all had a huge population relative to the size of the land. Yeah. So when the immigration was opened up, the Irishman, who didn't have any job in England, was starving, would come to Boston. They'd give him a job. Okay, we'll hire you as a ditch digger. We'll hire you as a fireman, a policeman.
Yeah.
So they rise. They say, well, rather than unionizing, we'll just become middle class, and we'll get more money, and we'll vote for the Democratic Party, Reform Party. Reform is enough. And we had a very conservative union, the AFL-CIO.
Yeah, Gompers was a conservative.
Yeah, he just said, well, we have...
Samuel Gompers.
Yeah, all we have to do is pay the plumbers, pay the cigar makers, and they'll get skill, and their wages will go up along with the prices. Well, that works fine until you come to the Depression of '29. Yeah. And then we have downscale, quick. In 1929, Marx has a revival in the United States, and socialism has a revival, and the Bolshevik Revolution stimulated it.
Yeah, you've always heard that line. I think it's maybe in a song. I don't know. It's Lenin read the book on Marx.
Right.
Is there truth in that?
Oh, he read Marx in and out.
Oh, yeah.
He spent his life reading that.
Okay.
He was a journalist. The Tsar put a price on his head, and he fled to Switzerland, and he lived in Zurich. And his job was to translate the German language that Marx had written in. He wrote Das Kapital in German, and that was a detailed economic thing about surplus value and why the stock market doesn't work and why there'll always be another panic, another recession, another slump. And there'll always have to be, and the capitalists will get bigger, and the big capitalists will buy out the small capitalists, and eventually socialism is inevitable, argued Marx. So socialism then was gaining in Germany first, followed by France. Britain was a little more conservative, and they had a Labour Party.
And Britain also had the empire.
Britain had the empire to expand. Yeah, they had the empire.
Sun never sets on the British.
Yeah, right. So anyway, there were 15 socialist parties on the eve of the First World War. And the Americans were one of the socialist parties, but it was probably the weakest of the socialists. And Eugene Debs in 1912 got 10% of the vote. That was the peak of American socialism.
And Debs didn't even become socialist. He didn't take that hard turn left until after the railroad strike.
Okay.
Of 1894.
Okay.
Which went to the Supreme Court. And since Labor Day was just a couple weeks ago, we'll cover this real quick too.
Good.
Eugene Debs organized the American Railroad Association's strike against the Pullman Car Company in 1894. And this led to President Grover Cleveland.
He had a recession. He had a panic. Cleveland panicked.
Yeah, because the Pullman cars were very important in the railroad, and so to have them shut down, Cleveland said, "Oh, this is a matter of national security and whatnot." He has the Supreme Court issue an injunction.
Right.
Sends in the army.
Right.
To break the strike.
Right.
And the army in the process kills 13 people.
Right.
This causes a lot of.
This is the Haymarket riot.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
This causes a lot of bad blood in order to relieve the bad feelings somewhat from this action of using the army to break the strike workers and people losing their lives. Cleveland declares Labor Day a federal holiday,
right.
Which is why we all got to go to picnics instead of working.
Right.
Last Monday.
But the original Labor Day was formed in the United States.
Yes.
May 1st.
Yes.
And the Soviets picked it up.
Yeah.
And the socialists in Europe picked it up.
Yeah. Oh, and after these events, Eugene Debs lost an important Supreme Court case, and that's when he turned left and became a perennial socialist candidate for president.
Right. He ran 3 times?
I think 3.
And then in 1917, the war was on, and Woodrow Wilson said that anybody strikes in World War I is a threat to his security, and arrested him for free speech.
Right, yeah.
And then he was put in jail, but he campaigned from jail.
Yeah.
But fortunately for Debs, the war was rather short.
Yeah, it was only a year and
Right.
some change that the United
And then
States
he
was
was
in it.
freed by Warren G. Harding, who sprung him from jail.
Yeah.
Then he soon died.
Yeah, he didn't live too far into the 20s, I don't think.
Yeah, and then Norman Thomas took over. Norman Thomas was a socialist candidate in 1948 against Truman.
Right. Yeah.
And I met a Jewish student at Bates College who voted for Norman Thomas.
Oh, okay.
He didn't want to be
Didn't want to be associated
associated with the
Truman.
Communist Party,
Yeah.
but he read Marxist literature and knew more about Marx than anybody on that campus.
Yeah. Interesting. See, isn't history fun, folks?
Well, anyway, I guess what the question originally was
What did Reagan know
about
about
Adam Smith, and I don't think
Smith.
he knew anything about the rise of socialism in
I don't
Europe,
think so.
and he couldn't tell the difference between a socialist, an anarchist, a Trotskyite. Those were all beyond his
A Luxembourg.
understanding. Yeah, didn't mean anything to him.
No, I don't think he knew history.
He got his history from a magazine
I don't
called
think
Human
he knew
Events.
Smith.
Human Events, J.
Right.
Edgar Hoover. And Reagan, as a poor man from Illinois, voted for the New Deal.
Yes.
But
Back when he was a Democrat before he met Nancy.
right, but he made money in Hollywood.
Sure.
And
And he
then,
became an FBI informant
That's
as
right.
the head of the Actors Union.
yeah, and then J. Edgar Hoover said, well, there are communists in that union. And Reagan just didn't have
Then he
it.
met Nancy, who came from a very political Republican family,
Yeah,
and
right.
Reagan turned very conservative and never looked back.
Right, you got it. So I don't think he knew anything about.
I don't think he read Smith. I don't think he read Marx. I don't
Didn't
think
have
he read
to.
Keynes for them.
Well, he had a little economics course in Eureka College, which just quoted the balanced budget and Adam Smith as infallible.
Yeah.
Nobody questioned it until John Maynard Keynes came along.
Yep.
Now, John Maynard Keynes is a kind of a partial socialist. He says, well, you got to socialize the banks.
Right.
Because everybody is in debt. 90% of the people are in debt. And you got to put a ceiling, a high income tax at the top.
Right.
And you got to put a floor under the bottom to increase the purchasing power.
Right.
That's why it was called demand, a new definition of demand.
Well, I think what Keynes saw was the tremendous opportunity and the evidence of exploitation
That's right.
with unfettered capitalism.
Right.
And so he developed his philosophy to account for that.
That's right. It was a temporary.
It wasn't
Priming of the
anti-capitalist. It was a tweaking of capitalism.
That's right.
To account for the exploitation that was possible.
Right. And you have to have a little bit of government deficit in order to have full employment. But he assumed that it would be over in 2 or 3 years. And maybe it was, but the Depression was harder to cure than any previous collapse. Because
Right.
of World War I, all of the states got into deficits,
Right.
huge deficits.
Right.
So
when the bottom fell out
right,
10 years later,
right,
it was just a mess. And while Roosevelt did a lot of things, his whole philosophy, he was not an ideologue. He would try
that's right.
different things
Right.
and see what worked and change things
Right.
if something didn't work. And he tried a lot of different things. I think he was fairly successful with programs like the CCA and whatnot,
Right.
getting
Right.
people to work, getting them doing things,
Right.
getting jobs up. But he wasn't really able to solve the Depression until World War II began.
Well, let's
and
get the
manufacturing.
statistics. The Depression bottomed in 1933 with 25% unemployed. And he got that down to 1939 through civilian production to
Right.
17%.
Yeah.
And then World War II came along, and
Yeah.
the deficit in Britain led to increased production in 1940 because the British had to borrow money from the United States And we were going, it was a kind of a reinforcement of Keynesianism.
Uh-huh.
So when we get to 1944, we only have 2% unemployment, the all-time low.
Right.
That's because they drafted 12 million men.
They've got all the people drafted, you've got all the women
Right.
taking over
We
the
have 2
factory
minutes
work.
for-
Yeah, we'll have to stop here. We haven't quite finished. We'll have to continue this in another session. But thank you for coming, and we'll get the finality of Reagan's economics next time. Do you want to summarize this?
Sure. Well, we've started with Reagan and his cabinet and the influential people in his cabinet, such as Weinberger building up the military and David Stockman, who ran the budget, who really this is when they really brought supply side Reaganomics into the American system.
Right.
And so we went from there, and we talked about the role David Stockman said, his later regrets,
Right.
His admission that it was a Trojan horse, and
Right.
and you can read more about that if you want in his book, The Triumph of Politics.
Have you actually seen the book?
No, I've never read it myself.
No, I haven't either.
Okay. Yeah.
But I understand that David Stockman went into private industry and made money.
Sure. Yeah, he did.
But all of his companies went bankrupt, but he made enough money to move to Greenwich, Connecticut. So he lives with a high income.
Well, he got by on himself then.
I see him on TV.
He has his own little
No, he's not a
business.
program, but he's doing some sort of advertisement
Yeah.
due to investments and all
Right.
that.
Yeah. You can have it in a Stockman investment service.
Oh,
Yeah.
well, good.
He gives you tips on how to make money. But I think he's competing with 4 or 5 other agencies. Anyway, thank you for coming.
Thank you for having me, Professor.
And we keep
Always
the
good to be
debate
here.
going. We call this debate is the oxygen of democracy. And please
That's
come
right.
again.
Absolutely.